Let's move on to the Middle East and Vladimir Putin's trip to the Middle East. Vladimir Putin actually just landed in the UAE a couple of hours ago as we're speaking here. Now remember, the Sheikh of the UAE, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, actually was the one who sort of positioned himself to negotiate the release of Brittany Griner. So there's so many interesting dynamics. Putin is going later today to Saudi Arabia. According to Russian government spokesman, they're going to be talking about the war in Ukraine. They're going to be talking about the war in Gaza. And of course, they're going to be talking about oil production. So in Saudi Arabia in particular, we can put the element up on the screen. While the kingdom has made a voluntary oil production cut of 1 million barrels a day, the New York Times reports, Russia has contributed smaller cuts to its exports, but not its production, despite Saudi attempts to convince Russian officials to take more action. Another important thing here, Putin is actually on Thursday in Moscow hosting the Iranian president. And Putin himself has not traveled beyond China, Iran, and some former Soviet states, actually, since he first invaded Ukraine back in February 2022. So he's doing UAE, Saudi Arabia in one day, and then hosting Iran in Moscow the next day, and set to negotiate over oil. Actually, a pro-Russian government daily paper, as the New York Times notes, reported on Tuesday that Russia would not oppose conducting talks with Ukraine in a European country like Hungary. So with these sort of three fronts, talking about Ukraine, talking about Israel and Gaza, and talking about oil, Ryan, you've made some really interesting points about a Trump-Biden matchup in 2024 and oil in particular, when you have the Saudi royal family very close to Jared Kushner and very close to the Trumps. What could potentially happen on that front when you talk about how the American election could potentially affect the conflicts and U.S. support, military support for the Ukrainian military and Ukrainian government, and for the Israeli military and the Israeli government? That's all on the line in the next year, which we are rapidly careening towards. So pretty interesting timing for this trip.
Yeah, and exactly. When Trump was president, he twice publicly, browbeat Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia to manipulate gas prices for electoral purposes. First in 2018, he wanted gas prices down for those midterms. And then in 2020, the collapse of gas prices was threatened to create its own economic crisis by triggering all kinds of weird defaults. If you remember, there was a time where oil was selling at below $0 a barrel. And that can cause mayhem in markets. And so he urged, MBS to kind of, pull back on production to kind of rescue, and he did it every time. As Biden has, pushed MBS, he's had, much less success. The reporting and the analysis that I've seen is pretty strongly indicative of the fact that, MBS would love to see Republicans, come back in office. Saudi Arabia has become more aligned with Republicans. There's been some reporting that, Putin thinks that, he might be able to get a better deal with Trump than with Biden. So you do have this interesting situation where, the elections are so organized around gas prices sometimes that you end up kind of outsourcing power over moving the needle of our electoral dial to people like, MBZ, MBS, Putin, et cetera. And also I can confirm out here in Los Angeles, they want $6 a gallon for gas. I thought they were making that up. I'm like, there's no way.
Blame Gavin Newsom.
No, Gavin Newsom, incredible.
Blame Ryan Grimm's green agenda. True. The grim green agenda.
That's true. Yeah, failed state out here. Tell you what.
Seriously. But actually, in the vacuum of what's perceived as U.S. leadership, other countries have started trying to negotiate sort of peace deals in Ukraine and in the Middle East, which has been kind of fascinating to watch because we really haven't seen that seriously in a matter of years, perhaps a matter of decades, really. And Business Insider's headline about the Putin trip is that he, quote, seeks to humiliate Biden by showing him that attempts to isolate Russia have failed. I mean, I don't know that that's his primary goal, but that is definitely, I think, probably an intended outcome from Vladimir Putin in this case, that he hasn't traveled outside of Russia, Iran, China since the invasion. And now that there's another hot conflict, two hot conflicts that the U.S. is waging almost as proxy wars, obviously as a proxy war in Ukraine and arguably as a proxy war in Israel and in Gaza. And precisely, by the way, with this axis of evil formulation, we've heard this from Netanyahu, we've heard this from other people about the alliance between Russia, Iran, and China, and then Iran's relationship with Hamas and Hezbollah. That's sort of been precisely the justification for U.S. involvement and for a broad Western sort of brick of support in this region. And this is in some ways bolstering those sort of claims. But on the other hand, if you have the Saudis squeezed between Trump and Biden and Putin, I mean, these dynamics are just so, it's a very fragile ecosystem. I mean, a very fragile ecosystem.
Yeah, and congratulations, I guess, to Iran for being the only country to make it into both axis of evils over the last 20 years. Poor North Korea and Iraq, didn't make the finals this time, replaced, I guess, by Russia and China in this. But the U.S., has everything. It seems like everything the U.S. has done over the last several years has just, hurt the U.S.'s own standing, vis-a-vis a lot of these countries. The Abraham Accords, were intended to kind of lock down U.S. alliances with Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, the rest of the Middle East, by basically cutting peace deals and ignoring the fact of the Palestinians. That hasn't worked, and now it threatens to kind of drive a wedge in between Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and others, which it seems like Putin is happy to kind of waltz into and see if he can capitalize on that. The other U.S. strategy was to rip up the Iran deal, and then Biden failed to get back into it, which has then further isolated Iran and has done nothing, obviously, to reduce its support for its proxies around the world. Hamas. It's climbed in the Iran-backed Houthis, whether the Syrian or Iraqi militias or Hezbollah, and then that then further kind of pushes them closer to China and to Russia, and so you just constantly see a receding of American influence through decisions that we continue to make, and then you throw on top of that our belief that by financing the Ukrainian kind of resistance to the Russian invasion, that we were going to dramatically weaken Russia's military capacity. It appears like Russia's military capacity in 2022 was actually pretty weak. They collapsed pretty quickly, but 2 years later they under the strain of actual combat. It seems like in some ways we've actually kind of strengthened them, as well as tightened their relationships with other global South countries as well. So even on its own terms, it doesn't seem like any of the belligerence that the U.S. is engaged with is actually even benefiting the United States, let alone all of the collateral damage that it's doing.
That is such an important point, because even on the sort of hawkish terms, when you're looking at what the war in Ukraine and now the war in Gaza have done to public support for militarism abroad, but B, and most importantly, from Putin's perspective, to our military industrial base. So a whole lot of people are arguing that the war in Ukraine, or a whole lot of, I guess, neoconservative war hawks are arguing that the war in Ukraine has just re-emboldened the U.S. industrial base, that we are, getting back to 1945 and the thriving military industrial complex that we so badly need, and it's just bringing the American economy into full bloom. And actually, that's not what's happening. If you look at people who are particularly concerned, even hawkish people that are particularly concerned about Taiwan, that are particularly concerned about how long it's going to take to onshore chips manufacturing in the United States, even with the CHIPS Act, all this has done has depleted our capacity to, again, even by sort of hawkish terms, support Taiwan in the case of an invasion. And we have heard Xi Jinping, who's allied with Vladimir Putin, talking very clearly about the sort of, he usually says like the peaceful unification process as it relates to Taiwan and everything like that. But the reality is the United States relies on Taiwan for national security, for a huge, huge chunk of our economy and our ability to sort of function with the technological necessities that we've come to depend on. And so if these two conflicts are affecting public support for militarism, and if they're affecting our actual ability to engage in a military conflict elsewhere, you can see very clearly how Putin would be finding allies in places like Iran and China, and how those relationships would be shored up, because there's a sort of mutually beneficial outcome of pushing the U.S. to burn more and more resources in Ukraine. And Putin obviously has his own problems. He's lost tens of thousands of people in battle, and was not initially as successful as they sort of expected to be in Ukraine. But this is, even by, I think it's such an important point, even by the standards that the hawks purport to be seeking, they're falling wildly short, and the Biden administration is falling wildly short. And I'm reminded of what Jake Sullivan said before October 7th and about the Biden administration's sort of perpetuation of the Abraham Accords. Although some conservatives would argue that its relationship with Iran had undercut its approval for the Abraham Accords, Jake Sullivan said, "You've never seen such peace in the Middle East." They just keep getting sort of smacked left and right by reality. Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.